Caleb Hartwell grabbed his sister's arm, dragged her to the center of the trading post, and said to Walter Crane, "Take her, she works hard. That clears the debt." He didn't whisper it. He didn't hesitate. He said it the way you state a price flat, final, already decided, before walking through the door. Eliza felt every man in that room turn to look at her. She was not merchandise. She was not a number in a ledger. She was a 25-year-old woman who had kept that family alive for 10 years with her bare hands. And her brother had just sold her for $60. But nobody in that room had counted on the man about to walk through that door. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. The cold that February was the kind that had intention behind it. Not weather, something personal. It came down off the northern ridge every morning before dawn and pressed itself against every door and window, in Pine Creek like a debt collector who knows you're home and isn't leaving. Eliza Hartwell had lived through 9 Montana winters, and she knew the difference between cold that was just cold and cold that was trying to tell you something. This winter was trying to tell her something. She just hadn't understood yet what it was. The walk into town had taken 40 minutes. She had spent those 40 minutes 3 steps behind her brothers, watching the backs of their heads, listening to the murmur of a conversation they were having too quietly for her to join. Caleb walked the way he always walked when he'd already made a decision, shoulders forward, chin down, pace just slightly too fast for comfort. Jonah walked beside him the way Jonah always walked beside Caleb, which was like a man who has tied himself to a larger boat and is mostly just trying not to get pulled under. She should have asked what they were walking into. She hadn't asked because 25 years of living with these 2 men had taught her that some questions only made things worse, and she had spent her entire adult life trying to make things better. It was, she would later understand, the central mistake of everything, not the asking, but the not asking, the quiet accommodation, the way she had learned to make herself small enough to fit whatever space her brothers left her. She was about to understand exactly how small they had decided she needed to be. Walter Crane's trading post occupied the largest building on Pine Creek's main road, and it smelled the way it always smelled: tobacco and salt meat and pine resin, and the particular human odor of men who spent most of their lives outdoors and bathed with less regularity than they probably intended. Walter himself stood behind the long counter, with his ledger open in front of him, his small, pale eyes moving from Caleb to the numbers on the page and back again with the patient, predatory calm of a man who has been owed money long enough that he stopped being angry about it and started simply enjoying the position of power. There were 8 other men in the room, hunters, mostly. 2 miners near the back stove, a boy sweeping the floor near the supply shelves who kept stopping and staring. Every single one of them went quiet when the Hartwells walked in. Eliza took her position 3 steps back, the way she always did. She told herself it was practical, gave the men room to negotiate, kept her out of the way. She had been telling herself that for years. She would eventually understand it was something else entirely. It was the physical manifestation of everything she had accepted about her own value. "You said by the 1st, Walter said. He didn't look up from the ledger. "I know what I said," Caleb answered. "The 1st was 11 days ago. There were complications. There are always complications with you, Caleb." Walter's finger moved down the column of numbers with the slow deliberateness of a man who wants you to feel every digit. $58.40. That's what I see. That's what I've been seeing since November. He looked up. "What I'm not seeing is money." Jonah stepped forward. He had that particular quality in his voice that Eliza had always recognized, the quality of a man trying to sound confident when every cell in his body knows he has no ground to stand on. "Walter, we're asking for 6 more weeks. The spring thaw. We can access the lower pasture, work the Henderson lumber contract." "Henderson pulled out," Walter said. The words hit the room like a stone hitting ice. Flat. Definitive. Jonah's voice died in his throat. His foreman was in here last week, buying out the crew's final wages. Walter continued. So whatever plan you built around Henderson's contract, you can dismantle it. He closed the ledger, then opened it again. The opening and closing was theatrical. The action of a man who knows he holds all the cards and wants to make sure everyone in the room understands the game. Here's where we are. The debt is due. If you can't pay it with money, we find another arrangement. That was when it happened. Caleb's eyes moved. Just slightly, just to the right. Past Jonah, past the edge of his own peripheral vision to where Eliza stood 3 steps back. It was a small movement. The movement of a man checking that something is still where he left it. She felt it like a hand closing around her throat. She had time, maybe 3 seconds, to understand what was coming. 3 seconds to watch her brother's shoulders drop slightly. Watch the last of his resistance leave his body the way water leaves a vessel that's been tipped. 3 seconds to think. He's been carrying this answer the whole walk here. He decided before we left the house. There might be another way to settle this, Caleb said. He reached back. He took her arm, and he pulled her forward to stand beside him at the counter, not roughly, not with cruelty, but with the specific casualness of a man moving a piece on a board. And he looked at Walter Crane and said, "She works. She keeps house. She cooks. She knows supply management. She can stretch stores through hard weather better than anyone I know. Put her to work in the back. Call the debt settled." The room went so silent that Eliza could hear the boy's broom stop moving. She stood at the counter. She looked at her own hands, flat on the wood in front of her. She made herself look at them, because if she looked at Caleb, she was going to do something that couldn't be undone. And she was a woman who had always understood the difference between what she felt and what the moment required of her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat and made them stop. "She cooks," Jonah added, from somewhere to her left. His voice was almost inaudible. "She knows preservation. She knows how to manage winter supplies. I know what she can do," Walter said. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her since the moment Caleb moved her forward. His eyes were the eyes of a man doing arithmetic, and she was the sum he was calculating. She made herself look back at him. She would not look down. That was the one thing she would not give him. Walter reached for his pen. "I'll clear the account," he said. "She starts Monday." And in that moment, in the specific moment, between Walter reaching for his pen and the nib-touching paper, the front door of Pine Creek Trading Post came off its frame. Not opened. Not swung. The force of it was physical, a full-body concussion of frozen air that hit the room like a wall falling inward. The lanterns above the counter swung hard on their hooks. Shadows lunged across the ceiling. The tin cup on the end of the nearest shelf went over and hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. 2 of the hunters, near the back wall, grabbed the edges of the table they were sitting at. The boy with the broom stumbled back into the supply shelf and sent 3 tins rattling. And in the doorway stood a man that made the doorway look like it had been built wrong. He was large the way mountains are large, not just in size but in presence. The kind of size that reorganizes a room simply by entering it. His coat was dark fur, frost-edged and heavy, and his shoulders filled the frame behind him. Snow covered his hat brim and lay in the angles of a dark beard that had gone uncut for a season or more. He held a rifle in his right hand, with the loose, unconsidered ease of a man who has carried one so long he no longer notices the weight. He stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him. He stood still for one full breath and let his eyes move across the room. Not quickly, not with any particular urgency. The eyes of a man who takes account of spaces before he moves through them, who notes the exits and the people and the positions without making a performance of doing so. His gaze crossed the hunters, the miners, Walter behind the counter, Caleb and Jonah standing rigid and suddenly very conscious of their own posture. And then it crossed Eliza. It stopped. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. He looked at her the way she could not remember ever being looked at. Not with pity. Not with assessment. Not with the particular sliding evaluation that most men's eyes did when they moved across a woman. He looked at her, the way you look at a person when you are trying to understand what they are feeling. Like her interior life was visible and worth reading. Then he looked at Walter. "Crane," he said. His voice came from somewhere low and certain. The voice of a man who speaks rarely enough that when he does, the words arrive with full weight. Walter Crane had gone the specific color of a man trying not to show that he's afraid. "Cross," he said. "Careful." The name of something he wasn't sure was safe to say at full volume. The man Cross moved to the counter. The room adjusted around him, the way a room adjusts around something large and deliberate. He set his rifle against the counter's edge, and sound that was soft and absolute. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch, small and dark-stained with use, and placed it between himself and Walter. The sound it made was the sound of real weight, not a performance, not a gesture, Cross said. Walter opened it. His hands were not quite steady. Gold, dust small nuggets, the color of late afternoon, the kind that comes from years of hard mountain work. Walter's lips moved. His eyes moved. He counted. The room waited in the specific suspended silence of a moment. Everyone present understands is significant, but nobody fully understands yet. "That covers it," Walter said. His voice had gone flat and neutral in the way of a man trying to show nothing. "That covers it, and then some," Cross said. "So you'll remember it settled." Caleb found his voice. He always found his voice. It was one of his least useful qualities. "Now wait just one moment. That debt belongs to my family. You have no standing to. The debt is gone," Cross said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at Caleb when he said it. Which was somehow worse. "There's nothing left to settle." "She was going to work it off," Walter started. Cross looked at him. Just looked. Walter picked up his pen. He drew a line through a column of numbers. He closed the ledger. Cross turned. He looked at Eliza again. "You're free," he said. Quiet, direct, not a rescue, a statement of fact. As if freedom were simply information she might find useful. "I didn't ask for your help," Eliza said. Her own voice startled her. She hadn't decided to speak. Something had decided for her, some part of her that had been quiet for 25 and had run out of patience in the exact same moment as everything else. Cross looked at her for a moment. Something moved at the edges of his eyes, not amusement, not offense, recognition maybe. The look of someone who has just heard something they understand. "No," he said. "You didn't." He picked up his rifle. He walked to the door. He stopped, his hand on the frame, his back to the room. "It'll be -20 tonight," he said. "Road north along the ridge. Cabins warm, food's there. No one to bother you." He walked out. The door closed. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the room made a sound. And then everyone did at once, the hunters, the miners. Walter reaching for his ledger again, out of pure reflex. The boy picking up his broom, with shaking hands, and the noise rushed into the space that had been left behind. Eliza didn't hear any of it. She was looking at her brothers. She looked at Caleb first. He was already rearranging his face into something that would allow him to explain not one a way he could live with. She could see him doing it in real time, the jaw working, the shoulders straightening, the particular reset of a man who intends to move forward by deciding the past is negotiable. She looked at Jonah. He was still staring at the floor. He had been staring at the floor since before Caleb moved her forward. He had stood there and stared at the floor and said nothing, not one word of protest. Not one hand reached out, nothing, while his brother traded their sister for a number in a book. "Eliza." Caleb moved toward her. "Listen, I need you to understand." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't explain it to me," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was the quietest it had ever been when she was this angry. And that quietness scared her a little because it told her how far past the ordinary register of her emotions she had gone. "Don't tell me you had no choice. Don't tell me it was temporary. Don't make me stand here in this room with these men and listen to you turn what you just did into something you can feel all right about." Caleb's mouth closed. "You moved me forward," she said. You put your hand on my arm, and you moved me forward like I was something you were handing across a counter. And you didn't look at me when you did it. You looked at the ledger." She paused. She let that sit in the air, where everyone in the room could feel it. "You looked at the ledger, because if you'd looked at me, you would have had to know what you were doing." The room was very quiet. Caleb said nothing. Jonah kept looking at the floor. She turned and walked to the door and walked out into the cold. The air hit her like a physical thing immediate. Breathtaking, a cold that got inside her lungs before she could brace for it. She stood on the steps of the trading post and looked at the stars above Pine Creek, which were brutal and bright in the way they only are when the temperature has dropped below anything comfortable. She was shaking, not from the cold. The shaking was from somewhere inside her chest, from somewhere that had been pressed down for years and was now pressing back. And she couldn't tell yet whether it was grief or rage or relief or all three happening at once in the specific way that big truths arrive not one at a time, but all together. Too much to sort, too real to deny. She pressed her hands against her coat and breathed. The man Cross was at his horse near the corner of the building. He had his back to her. He was checking the cinch on his saddle with the unhurried competence of someone who has done this 10,000 times in weather twice as bad as this. He hadn't waited. He wasn't watching the door. He had given her information. He had left the door open. What she did with it was entirely her own. She stood in the cold, and she took inventory of her options, the way she always took inventory of things methodically. Without sentiment, starting with what was true. She could go back to the homestead. She could sit across the breakfast table from Caleb tomorrow morning while he built the version of tonight that he could live with. And she could watch Jonah avoid her eyes. And she could do what she had always done, which was absorb the damage and keep the household running and give everyone around her the grace of never having to fully reckon with what they'd done. She had been doing that for 10 years. She could find somewhere else in town. But it was -20, and she knew exactly which families would take her in and exactly what form that debt would take. And she had just spent the last 10 minutes watching herself be traded for one debt, and she did not intend to walk directly into another. Or she was already walking. She didn't decide to walk north. She simply noticed that her feet had already begun. And she let them continue. Because some decisions are made by a part of you that has been waiting much longer than the thinking part. And when that part finally moves, the best thing you can do is get out of its way. Cross heard her when she was 20 feet back. He turned, one hand still on the horse's neck, and looked at her without surprise. Without satisfaction either, without the expression of a man who has just gotten what he expected. Just a man noting a fact. "I'm not in your debt," she said. She stopped 6 feet from him. "I want that settled before anything else." He held her gaze. The cold moved between them. "Settled," he said. He mounted the horse. He started north. She walked beside him. She didn't fully understand. In those first minutes on the ridge road, why she felt less afraid, walking beside a stranger in the dark than she had felt in years, walking beside her own family. She filed the question the way she filed things she didn't have answers to, yet carefully. In a place she could return to. The road was narrow and the wind came in long. Cold waves off the mountain, and Cross rode with his chin down and his coat collar up, and he did not speak, and she did not speak, and the silence between them had none of the tension she expected. It was simply silence. Two people moving through the same darkness in the same direction, needing nothing from each other in the space between here and there. The cabin appeared as a low shape against the dark trees, with firelight in one window. He had banked a fire before leaving. She noted, which meant he planned to return to warmth regardless of how the night went, which meant this offer had not been made on impulse. He had thought of it before he came down the mountain. She stored that fact in the same place as the question. He pushed the door open without ceremony. Woods to the left. Blankets on the shelf, bedrooms in the back. Door latch sticks lift. Before you pull in the morning. He went directly to the fire and began building it up. Back to her. No performance of hospitality. no waiting to be thanked. Eliza stood in the middle of the room. She looked at the books along the window ledge. She looked at the supply shelves, organized and full. She looked at the table, with its 2 chairs, set at equal distance from each other, neither position saying, "This space belongs to me more than you." She looked at the back of this man's head as he fed the fire with the specific attention of someone doing a thing because it needs doing, not because anyone is watching. "Why did you come into the trading post tonight?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. A log settled into the fire. "I heard things," he said. "What things?" "Enough," he said. She waited. Nothing more came. She took the blanket from the shelf. She walked to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she listened to the sounds of the fire being built in the other room, and the wind against the north wall, and the silence that was somehow the loudest thing she had heard all day. And then, because she was alone, and the door was shut, and no one needed anything from her, she put her face in her hands. She did not sob. She was not a woman who sobbed. But something came out of her chest in the dark, a sound that was almost nothing. Almost less than a breath, the sound of a person who has been holding something for 10 years, and has finally, in the dark alone, let the grip loosen by 1 degree. She sat with it. She gave herself exactly the length of time it took the fire to settle from building to burning, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5. And then she straightened. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She lay down on the narrow bed, with her coat still on, and she stared at the ceiling. She thought about the trading post, about Caleb's hand on her arm, about the ledger, about $60. She thought about the man in the other room who had paid $60, and then told her she owed him nothing and meant it. She thought, "I don't know what this is, but it is not what I came from." She closed her eyes. Outside, the temperature fell past 20 below. The snow packed itself against the walls, and the fire in the other room held, built up and tended by a man who slept beside it to make sure it didn't go out. She slept better than she had in years. When she woke, gray light was at the window, and the fire was burning fresh, and there was coffee on the stove. And Gideon Cross was sitting at the table with a book. And he looked up when she came out, and he said, "Coffee's ready," and looked back at his book. She poured a cup. She sat down across from him. He read. She drank her coffee. Nobody asked her for anything. It was, she thought, the strangest and most extraordinary morning of her life. She sat with both hands around the cup, and she felt the warmth come into her palms, and she thought, "I will not be foolish. I will watch, and I will wait. And I will not confuse kindness with safety because I have been wrong before." But she thought also, whatever this is, it is the first morning in longer than I can remember that began without dread. She drank her coffee. The winter held outside, and inside the cabin above Pine Creek, 2 people who had both been broken by different losses sat across a wooden table from each other and said nothing. And the nothing between them was the specific nothing of a beginning quiet and unremarkable and carrying, underneath its surface, the full weight of everything that was about to change. She woke on the second morning, knowing something had shifted in her. Not fixed, not healed, shifted the way a bone shifts after a break. Finding a new position that isn't the original, but is at least stable enough to put weight on. She lay in the narrow bed for a moment and took stock of herself the way she took stock of supply shelves methodically, without sentiment, starting with what was actually true. She was alive. She was warm. Nobody had asked her for anything since she walked through that door. Those 3 facts were more than she'd been able to say about most mornings in the past 10 years. She got up. Gideon was already outside. She could hear the axe, that same clean, rhythmic crack she'd fallen asleep to, and she stood at the window for a moment and watched him work without letting herself think too carefully about why she was watching. He moved with the economy of someone who has done hard physical work long enough that his body has absorbed it completely. No wasted motion, no performance, just the axe and the wood and the cold, and a man who had apparently been awake since before dawn doing what needed to be done. She turned away from the window. She built the fire up. She found the coffee. She made it for two because there was no logical reason not to. And she was above all things a logical woman. He came in 20 minutes later, cold coming off his coat, and he saw the 2 cups, and he looked at her, and he said nothing. He poured his cup, and sat at the table, and wrapped both hands around it, the way she had wrapped both hands round hers the morning before. And she thought, we are already learning each other's habits. The thought made her set her cup down a little harder than she intended. I need to know the rules, she said. He looked up from his cup. The rules of being here, she said. What you expect. What you don't. I don't operate well in situations where the terms aren't clear. He held her gaze for a moment. There aren't many rules. There are always rules, she said. The question is whether they're stated or assumed. I prefer stated. He set his cup down. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it. Which she noticed, because most men responded to direct questions with the first thing that came to them and called it an answer. He was quiet long enough that she could tell he was actually considering. You sleep inside, he said. I sleep near the fire. What's in the cabin is yours to use. If you need something I haven't thought to provide, say so. He paused. I work every day early. I don't expect you to keep a particular schedule. I don't expect meals at specific times. I don't expect anything. Actually. He picked up his cup. That's the full list. She looked at him. That's not a list of rules, she said. That's a list of things you're not requiring of me. Yes, he said. What do you require? He thought again. She was going to have to get used to these pauses. Honesty, he said. If something's wrong, say so. If you decide to leave, say so. Don't disappear and don't lie. He drank his coffee. That's what I require. She turned that over. It was a shorter list than she'd expected. It was also, she recognized, a list built by someone who had experienced the specific pain of being left without warning and lied to about important things. She didn't know the details yet. She could feel the shape of the wound through the requirements he'd built around it. Agreed, she said. He nodded. He picked up a piece of leather from the shelf harness strap, cracked along one edge, and began working it. She went to the supply shelves and began doing what she'd been wanting to do since she first looked at them 2 days ago, which was reorganize them properly. He had good supplies and poor organization. Everything he needed was present, and none of it was where it should be. She worked. He worked. The fire burned. Outside, the wind moved against the north wall with its slow, constant pressure. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when she realized she was not waiting for something to go wrong. She had been waiting for it since she walked through his door. Waiting for the hidden requirement, the shifted terms, the moment when his patience ran out or his real intentions surfaced. She had been carrying that waiting in her body, the way you carry tension in your shoulders, so constantly that you forget it's there until something releases and you feel the absence of it. At some point, without her noticing, the waiting had paused. She did not call it trust. She was not ready to call it trust. But she noted its absence the way you note the absence of a sound you've grown so used to that silence becomes its own distinct thing. Your shelves are wrong, she said. He looked up. They work. They work the way a broken wheel works, she said. Technically but badly. Your dry goods are against the exterior wall. They're pulling moisture from the cold on the other side. Your preserves are on the highest shelf, where temperature fluctuates most with the fire. Your medical supplies are behind everything else, which means if you need them in a hurry, I've needed them in a hurry twice, he said. And a pause. It took longer than it should have, he admitted. I'm moving everything, she said. All right, he said. She moved everything. He watched occasionally from the table. Not to supervise, but with the particular attention of someone learning a system they hadn't considered before. Once he got up without being asked and shifted the heavy sack of flour. She couldn't reach the position she was pointing at. He did it and went back to his chair without comment. She reorganized the shelves in an hour and a half. When she was done, she stood back and looked at them and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly, not for praise. Not to be seen, just the clean internal satisfaction of order imposed on chaos. Better, he said from the table. Considerably, she said. He made a sound. Not quite agreement, not quite a laugh. The sound of someone who has been living alone, long enough that someone else's competence in their space is both competence, this, slightly disorienting, and she thought she heard this underneath something else. Something like relief. She didn't say anything about it. She sat back down across from him. Your turn, she said. He looked up. I told you the rules I need, she said. You know why I'm here. I know nothing about you, except that you paid a debt that wasn't yours, and you live alone on a mountain, and you own 11 books. She held his gaze. That's not enough information to share a space with someone safely. He was quiet. I'm not asking for your history, she said. I'm asking for enough to know what I'm working with. He set the leather down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. My name is Gideon Cross, he said. I've lived on this mountain for 9 years. Before that, I worked the mines in the upper territory. 3 years of hard work that paid better than it should have because most men don't stay long enough to reach what's deeper. I built this cabin myself. I run trap lines from October through March and work the Upper Creek claim through the summer. I have enough, he paused. I had a wife and a son. They died 9 winters ago, in a crossing I should have waited on. He said it the way you state a fact you've made peace with, not easily. Not without cost, but with the specific steadiness of something you've been carrying so long you've learned its weight exactly. Since then I've lived alone because it seemed simpler. Eliza kept her face still. I'm sorry, she said, because it was true, and because he had said it plainly, and plain things deserved plain responses. 9 years ago, he said, I don't say it for sympathy. I know, she said. You said it so I'd understand why you live the way you do. She looked at her cup. And why you came into the trading post. He looked at her. A man who has lost everything he cared about, she said quietly, and has decided solitude is simpler, that man doesn't walk into a crowded room and spend $60 of gold on a stranger's problem. She met his eyes. Unless something he saw reminded him of something he understood. The fire was the only sound in the room. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She picked up her cup. He picked up the harness strap. What was her name? Eliza said. A pause. Eleanor. And your son Thomas. The name came out differently than Eleanor had smaller. More careful. The name of something that hadn't had enough time. He was 3. He had just learned the word horse. He called everything a horse dogs, birds, the cat that lived at the livery. His jaw moved. He would have been 12 this year. Eliza looked at the table. She thought about a child who called everything a horse and would have been 12 this year. She thought about what it cost a man to hold that fact in his body every day for 9 years and continue waking up and building fires and working trap lines and making coffee for 2 even when there was only 1. Thomas is a good name, she said. He looked up at her. Yes, he said, it is. They sat in the quiet that follows something real being said. And neither of them tried to fill it with anything. And that was exactly right. That was the pattern of the first week. Work in parallel. Eat at the same table. Exchange information in the specific way of people who are building a working knowledge of each other, not intimacy yet. Not trust exactly, but the functional understanding of shared space. She learned that he woke at 4, regardless of what the day required. He learned that she reorganized things when she was thinking through a problem. She learned that the marked page in the Tennyson book was a poem about grief that he had apparently read enough times to have memorized, but still needed to see on the page. He learned that she could track weather by pressure changes she felt in her joints before they showed in the sky. On the 5th day, she found the marked page herself. She had been looking at the bookshelf while he was outside, running her fingers along the spines, the way she always did with books, reading them by touch first, assessing wear and use. The Tennyson fell open naturally to the marked page. The way books open to pages they've been opened to many times. She read it. She stood there for a long time with the book in her hands. He came back in, and she was still standing there. He saw the book. He saw her face. He took off his coat and hung it and said nothing. It's about going on, she said. not looking up from the page. Everyone always talks about grief poetry as being about loss. This one isn't. It's about the part after. The part where you have to keep moving even when moving feels like betrayal. He was still. That's the part nobody talks about, she said, because it's harder than the grief itself. She closed the book. She set it back carefully in its place. My mother died when I was 14. I was angry for 2 years afterward, not at anything specific. Just angry the way a fire is angry when it's been given too much wood and not enough air. She turned. And then one morning I woke up and the anger was gone, and I didn't know what to do with myself because the anger had been something to hold on to. He was looking at her. I reorganized the kitchen that day, she said. Put everything in its right place. I think that was the day I became the person I am. She paused. The person who fixes things instead of feeling them. Is that a complaint? He said. Quiet, genuine. She thought about it honestly. Sometimes, she said. Tonight, no. He nodded. She went to start dinner, and he moved to help without being asked. And the evening proceeded, and neither of them said anything else about the book, or Eleanor, or Thomas, or dead mothers, or the specific loneliness of being the person who keeps moving. But something had moved between them. Not crossed. Not resolved. Just moved. The way furniture moves when a room is being rearranged, same pieces. Different positions, and the space between them changed by what had shifted. It was on the 8th day that she noticed the track. She had gone out to check the south fence line. Gideon had asked her to note any breaks. And she had gone because she needed air and needed to move. The way she always needed to move when her mind was working on something she hadn't fully identified yet. She found the break easily enough, a post down near the eastern corner. And she was crouching to assess it when she saw the track. Single boot print. Fresh, the edges were still sharp, which in this cold meant less than 2 hours old. Size of a large man. The tread pattern was specific, distinctive, not a working man's boot. The print was positioned not on the fence line, but 15 feet inside it. Pointed toward the cabin. Someone had been standing here. Inside the property, facing the cabin. She looked at the track for a long time without touching it. She looked at the tree line beyond the fence. She looked at the cabin. Visible from this position, visible clearly, every window. The door, the woodpile, the horse shelter. She stood up. She walked back to the cabin at a steady pace, because running communicated something to anyone who might still be watching. Gideon was at the table. He looked up at her face, and whatever he saw there made him set down what he was holding immediately. What? He said. Single track, she said. South fence line. Inside the property, oriented toward the cabin. Fresh. Not yours. He was already standing. How fresh, he said. Sharp edges, she said. Less than 2 hours. His jaw set. He moved to the rifle rack. You know whose it is, she said. He took his coat off the hook with the slow, controlled movement of a man who is angry and has decided not to let the anger make his decisions. There's a man named Rudd, he said. He's been watching this property since fall. He knows about the gold I pulled from the upper creek. How much does he know? Enough to want it. Gideon pushed the door open. Enough to have come here twice already with offers I declined. He paused in the doorway. Come show me the track. She showed him. He crouched over it and read it the way she had read it without touching. Just looking. She watched his face and saw the confirmation move through it. Rudd, he said. Or one of his men, she said. Rudd does his own reconnaissance, Gideon said. He stood. He's careful that way. He wants to see things himself before he decides what to do about them. He looked at the tree line. He's been here before and he's coming back. The question is what changed, she already knew. I changed, she said. He looked at her. You walked into a public room and paid $60 in gold in front of 8 men, she said. That tells everyone within 40 miles 2 things. 1, you have gold. 2, she held his gaze. You care about something. And a man who cares about something can be moved. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He'll use you, he said. Not a question. He'll try, she said. Which means I need to know everything about him before he gets the opportunity. They went inside. Gideon told her about Rudd, all of it, from the first visit to the most recent offer. From the creek claim 2 valleys over to the 2 men, Rudd had brought with him the second time to make the offer feel less like a request and more like a situation. He told her about the track he'd noticed at the property edge 3 weeks ago that he'd attributed to an animal until now. He told her about the supply of firewood moved 6 inches from where he'd stacked it. She listened to all of it, and when he was done, she said, "He's been building a picture of this property for months. He knows your patterns. He knows your trap lines. He knows when you're gone and how long." She looked at her coffee. "He didn't know about me." "No," Gideon said. "So he came back to update his picture." "Yes, which means his next move has already changed from whatever it was before." She set her cup down. "We need to change ours first." He looked at her across the table with that direct, level attention that she was learning to read. This was him surprised. Not showing it, but surprised. He said. "This became my problem. The night you paid $60 in a room full of people," she said. "Whether I like it or not. Whether you planned it or not." She looked at him steadily. "I'd rather work it than have it worked on me." A pause. Then, "All right," he said. She pulled the notebooks she used for supply records across the table and opened it to a blank page. "Tell me everything about Rudd's property approach," she said. "Every path he could use. Every position that gives a sightline to the cabin. Every weak point in your fence line." She picked up the pencil. "Start from the north." He started from the north. They worked for 2 hours. She drew as he described, not a map. Exactly. More a record of threat positions and response options. The kind of document a person builds when they are taking a problem seriously enough to put it on paper. He knew the land, the way he knew his own body, instinctively. Completely, and she knew how to organize instinctive knowledge into usable form. And together, they built something that neither of them could have built alone. At some point in the second hour, she realized he was looking at her instead of the page. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He looked back at the page. She let it go. She filed it in the same place as all the other things she was being careful with. That night, she lay in the narrow bed and thought about the track in the snow, and about Rudd, and about gold, and about the specific geometry of danger, how it arranges itself around the things a person cares about, how it finds the soft places and applies pressure there. She thought about Caleb and Jonah sitting in the homestead 10 miles south, and she thought about the trading post, and she thought about $60. She thought about Gideon saying "we" when she said it, without hesitation or condition. She thought about Eleanor and Thomas, and about a man who had decided 9 years ago that solitude was simpler, and who had recently, for reasons he had not fully stated and she had not fully asked about, decided something else. She was not going to be foolish about it. She was not going to build something in her imagination and then be surprised when reality didn't match. She had done that before, with people who hadn't deserved the architecture she'd built around them. But she was going to be honest. And honestly, for the first time in her adult life, she was in a situation where the person standing next to her was not taking something from her. He was not borrowing her labor or her patience or her capability without acknowledgement. He was not arranging her life around his convenience. He was working beside her on a shared problem and deferring to her judgment on the things she understood better than him and asking for her knowledge as if it had value. It was such a simple thing. It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had done for her in 10 years. She closed her eyes. In the other room, she heard him bank the fire for the night. She heard him settle. She heard him pick up his book. And she heard him stop reading. The silence that followed was the silence of someone sitting with something they hadn't finished deciding yet. She recognized it. She recognized it because she the same thing from the other side of the wall. She did not call it by name, but she held it carefully in the dark. The way you hold something you don't fully understand, but know enough not to drop. Outside, the wind came hard and steady off the mountain, and the temperature fell past anything comfortable. And in the cabin above Pine Creek, 2 people lay awake on opposite sides of a wall and thought about the same thing from different directions. And on the south fence line, in a track that was slowly being filled by fresh snow, the first real shape of danger waited to be understood. They had 2 days before Rudd made his first move. Neither of them knew that yet, but Eliza, who had been reading situations her whole life before the people in them understood what they were, felt it in the specific way she felt weather coming in her joints, in the particular quality of the silence, in the fact that something that had been waiting had stopped waiting and begun to move. She lay still. She breathed. She thought, whatever is coming, I am already ahead of it. She had to believe that. She had spent her whole life making that belief true. Rudd moved on the 3rd day, not with subtlety, not with the careful, patient approach of a man who had spent months building a picture of this property and its occupant. He moved the way a man moves when something has changed in his calculation, and patience has become a liability, fast and direct, and with enough force to make the point without wasting time on nuance. Eliza was at the supply shelf when she heard the horse. One horse, coming up the north road at a pace that was neither casual nor panicked. The specific pace of someone who has decided on an action and is executing it before the decision can be reconsidered. She was at the window before the sound fully registered, and she saw the rider and felt everything in her go quiet and alert the way it went quiet and alert when something required her full attention. Not Rudd. Too young, too slight. A hired man someone paid to deliver a message in the form of a person rather than a note. Because a person standing in your doorway is harder to ignore than paper. She stepped back from the window. Gideon. He came out of the back immediately. He had been repairing a trap mechanism at the back workbench. He looked at her face, and then at the window. Rider, she said. North Road, not Rudd. One of Gideon moved to the rifle rack. He took his rifle down, checked it with the practiced efficiency of someone who checks rifles the way other people check whether a door is locked automatically. Without drama, I'll go out, he said. We'll go out, she said. He looked at her. Don't, she said. Don't tell me to stay inside a beat. I wasn't going to, he said. She took her coat off the hook. They went out together. The rider pulled up 10 feet from the cabin door and sat his horse with the particular discomfort of a young man who has been given a job he doesn't fully want. He was maybe 20, with a thin beard and red cold ears, and the look of someone who had agreed to this before he'd thought it through and was now thinking it through and finding it less agreeable than it had seemed. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the rifle. I have a message, he said. Say it, Gideon said. The young man pulled a folded paper from his coat. He held it out. Gideon didn't move toward it. Read it, Gideon said. The young man unfolded it. His hands were not steady. He read, Mr. Cross, I've made 3 reasonable offers on your creek claim and your mining stake, all of which you've declined. I'm prepared to make a 4th offer, which will be my final one. I request a meeting at your convenience. No later than Friday. If no meeting occurs by Friday, I'll take that as a final answer and proceed accordingly. He refolded the paper. That's what it says. Proceed accordingly, Eliza said. What does he mean by that? The young man looked at her. I don't know, ma'am. I was just asked to deliver the letter. Who asked you? Rudd. How long have you worked for Mr. Rudd? The young man blinked. He had not expected to be questioned. He had expected to deliver the letter and leave. 6 weeks, ma'am. Where are you from, Billings? She nodded. Thank you for riding up, she said. Her voice was pleasant, which was not the same as warm. Tell Mr. Rudd that Mr. Cross received the message. The young man looked at Gideon, uncertain whether the woman speaking constituted an official response. Gideon said nothing. He simply looked at the rider with an expression that communicated, without words, that what the woman had said was exactly what was going to be said, and there was no further information forthcoming. The young man left. They watched him go. When the sound of hooves faded, Eliza turned and went back inside. Gideon followed. Proceed accordingly, she said. She hung up her coat. He already knows what accordingly means. He wrote the letter after he'd decided on accordingly. The letter is the last courtesy, before he stops being courteous. Yes, Gideon said. Friday, she said. Today is Tuesday. That's 3 days. 3 days to meet with him, or 3 days before he stops asking, Gideon said. You're not meeting with him. No. Then we have 3 days. She sat at the table. What does he actually want? Not the creek claim, not the mining stake, those are the stated things. What does he actually want? Gideon sat across from her. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, thinking. The creek claim is the legal mechanism, he said. But what he actually wants is the property, the cabin, the land, the established position. He's been working the territory for 2 years, and he has nothing to show for it. He wants what I've built, which means he doesn't just want to buy you out, she said. He wants to move in, yes. So even if you sold him the mining stake, he'd find another reason to come back. Gideon looked at her. Yes, I've understood that since the second offer. Then there's no version of this where he gets what he wants and you're still here, no. She was quiet for a moment. She was arranging the facts, the way she arranged supply shelves, everything, in its right position. The relationships between things as important as the things themselves. He came from Billing, she said. Rudd, his man. 6 weeks in the territory. Rudd hired men from outside because nobody local would take the work. She looked at Gideon. That tells us something. It tells us that whatever Rudd is planning, he knows it won't sit well with the people who have to live here afterward. He's importing consequences so he can export them when he's done. Gideon looked at her with that expression she was learning, the one that meant he had understood something she'd said at a level he wasn't going to verbalize. How do you know about land disputes? He said. My father had 2 of them before he left, she said. I was 11 and 12. I sat in on every conversation because nobody thought to ask me to leave. She paused. It was the first time I understood that paying attention was a form of power. He nodded slowly. We need to know what he's filed, she said. Whether there's a legal component already in motion, or whether this is still just pressure. The land office is in Helena, he said. I know where it is, she said. Who in Pine Creek would know what's been filed? Tom Briggs, he said. The sheriff. He gets notices of significant land filings in his jurisdiction. Then someone needs to go to Tom Briggs. They looked at each other across the table. Not you, she said. If you ride into town, Rudd knows within an hour that you're taking the legal angle seriously. He'll accelerate. She held his gaze. I'll go. Eliza, I'm not a person Rudd is watching, she said. Not yet. I'm a woman who's been staying in your cabin. People in Pine Creek will have opinions about that. But Rudd won't see me as a threat. He'll see me as a distraction. She let that land for a moment. That's the most useful thing I can be right now. He didn't argue. She noticed that about him, he didn't argue with logic out of pride. He weighed it and accepted it, or he weighed it and explained specifically why it was wrong. He didn't reflexively resist, simply because the logic came from her. Tom Briggs is careful, Gideon said. He won't tell you anything official. But if you listen to what he doesn't say, as well as what he does, I know how to listen, she said. She rode into town the next morning on Gideon's second horse, which was a solid gray animal with a calm disposition that she appreciated under the circumstances. The ride took 40 minutes, most of which she spent thinking through exactly what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. Because a conversation like this required profession. The front pair required you needed to know where the weak points were before you started. Pine Creek in February was a town moving at the pace of people who were conserving energy for the duration of the winter. She rode past the trading post without looking at it and felt the back of her neck tighten anyway. She found Tom Briggs at his office, which was exactly where a good sheriff should be, on a Tuesday morning in hard weather. And she knocked, and he called her in, and he looked at her with the measured expression of a man who had heard the story of what happened in the trading post and had formed an opinion about it that he was professionally declining to express. Miss Hartwell, he said. Sheriff Briggs, she said. I'll be direct because I think you prefer that. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I do, she sat. I'm staying at Gideon Cross's cabin on the northern ridge. I suspect you're aware of that. The territory is small, he said. Yes. I'm also aware that you know about the situation with Rudd. You know about the offers. You know about the track on the south fence line. She watched his face. And I think you may know whether there's anything filed in Helena that I should be aware of. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He was a man of about 50, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades managing the difference between what the law said and what was right, and had learned to hold those two things simultaneously without letting either one destroy the other. He reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a document. He set it on the desk between them, face down. He didn't turn it over. He said, I can't share official communications from the Helena Land Office with private citizens. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the desk. Eliza looked at the document face down between them. She turned it over. Land claim notification. Rudd's name. Gideon's property description. Filed 6 weeks ago under a provision for abandoned or insufficiently maintained mineral claims. The language was dense and legal, but the substance was clear. Rudd had filed a claim asserting that Gideon's mining activity had lapsed below the threshold required to maintain exclusive rights. It was not true, but it was filed. She read it completely. She turned it back over. She placed it exactly where it had been. Briggs came back to his desk. He sat down. He looked at the document as if seeing it for the first time. 30 days from the filing date, she said, the claim can no longer be challenged on procedural grounds. He looked at her. The filing date on that document, she said, was 6 weeks ago. Briggs said nothing. Which means the procedural window is already closed, she said. Which means the challenge has to be substantive evidence of active occupancy and continuous use. She held his gaze. How long does a substantive challenge take to process in Helena? That's not a question I can answer, Briggs said carefully. Approximately, she said. He looked at his desk. Approximately, he said. A thorough substantive challenge with strong documentation could be filed and acknowledged within 10 days if the right people handled it. And if the challenge is filed before Rudd's men take any action that compromises the current occupant's ability to maintain the claim, then the claim stands, and Rudd's filing fails, Briggs said. He looked at her steadily. That's a general statement about how land law works. Not legal advice. Understood, she said. She stood up. Thank you for seeing me, Sheriff. He stood Miss Hartwell. He paused. Rudd brought men in from Billings last week. 3 of them. I don't have cause to act on that information, but I have it. She looked at him. I'll note that, she said. She rode back to the cabin with the specific focused energy of someone who has just received a large amount of bad news and has already begun converting it into a plan. She had 12 days before Rudd's legal position became unassailable. She had an unspecified number of days before his Billings men did something that Briggs would have cause to act on. She needed documentation of continuous active use. She needed someone to ride to Helena. She needed both of those things to happen before Rudd decided that the slower approach was taking too long. She was halfway up the ridge road when she heard the second horse. Behind her, gaining. She didn't turn around. She kept her pace steady, her hands loose on the reins, and she listened and calculated one horse, moving faster than hers, rider comfortable in the saddle. Coming from Pine Creek direction, she turned at the next bend, where the road widened slightly, and faced back. Caleb. He pulled up hard, Throughead, and his horse threw its head. And had been doing something complicated behind them since she'd walked out of the trading post 2 weeks ago. I need to talk to you, he said. You're talking, she said. She did not move her horse aside to let him ride beside her. Eliza. His voice was different from the last time she'd heard it. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was left was rawer. Less prepared. I went to Cross's cabin yesterday. He wasn't there. You weren't there. He paused. I didn't know where you were, and I didn't. He stopped. I didn't like not knowing where you were. She looked at her brother. He looked worse than he had in the trading post. Thinner. The gray under his eyes had deepened. He had the specific worn quality of a man who hasn't been sleeping because his own thoughts won't let him. "You lost the right to know where I am," she said. "I know that. You lost it in a public room in front of 8 men when you decided my location was information that belonged to Walter Crane. I know that." He said it without defense, without the machinery of self-justification that she'd expected. Just those 3 words, flat and owned. She looked at him. She looked for the angle, the approach, the thing he wanted that was making him say the right things. She looked for it, the way she always looked for it, because the alternative was trust, and she was not ready to give him trust. She couldn't find the angle. "What do you want, Caleb?" she said. "I want to fix it," he said. "You can't fix it." "I know I can't fix it." His jaw worked. "But I want to try to do something that makes it." He stopped himself. Reorganized. "I heard things in town, about Rudd. About the claim he filed." He held her gaze. "I know things about Rudd that you might not know. Things about how he operates. And I have—" He reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded document. "I've been keeping records. Supply purchases, land use, livestock, everything that touches the homestead property, including the north fence line that borders Cross's eastern claim. I've been keeping records since Father left because somebody had to." He held it out. "It's not what Cross needs exactly, but it shows continuous occupancy of the adjacent land going back 7 years, and that might support—" "Where did you get the idea that's what he needs?" she said. "Tom Briggs," Caleb said. "I went to see him this morning." She stared at her brother. "Before or after me?" she said. "After," he said. "He told me you'd been in. He told me—" He paused. "He told me you were already ahead of it. He said it the way you say something about a person when you're surprised they're the person they turned out to be." His voice shifted. "I wasn't surprised, Eliza. I knew exactly who you were. I've always known. I used it instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of valuing it," she said. "Yes," he said. She sat on her horse in the cold and looked at her brother and felt the complicated thing that she felt every time she tried to locate what she was supposed to do with him. Love was there. It had always been there. It was not the kind of love that disappeared because of a single terrible moment. And she had known that, since the moment in the trading post, that she would love him even through this, which was possibly the most infuriating aspect of the whole situation. "Ride with me," she said. "You can tell Gideon what you told me about Rudd. And you'll give him those records." She moved her horse. "But Caleb, you're not forgiven. What I'm doing right now is practical, not personal. You understand the difference," he said. "Say it back to me so I know you heard it." A pause. "You're bringing me because it's useful," he said. "Not because we're all right." "We're not all right," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on deserving all right. That'll take longer than today," she said. "I know that too," he said. She rode north. He rode beside her. They arrived at the cabin to find Gideon at the door. He had heard 2 horses and had his rifle. And when he saw Caleb, his jaw went tight in the way that jaws go tight when a man has an opinion he's deciding whether to act on. "He has information about Rudd," Eliza said, before anything else could happen. "And records that might support the land challenge." She looked at Gideon. "He's here because he's useful. That's all it is right now." Gideon looked at Caleb for a long moment. Caleb met his eyes. He did not look away. Whatever he saw in Gideon Cross's face, and Eliza knew exactly what was in that face, because she had been on the receiving end of Gideon's full attention, and it was not a comfortable experience when you had reason to feel guilty. Caleb absorbed it without flinching. "Come in," Gideon said. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without decoration, not forgiveness, not welcome. Just a door opened because it was the practical thing to do. They sat at the table, all 3 of them. Gideon poured coffee without being asked, because that was what he did, and Caleb wrapped both hands around his cup the way people do when they need something to hold. And Eliza sat with her back straight, and her notebook open, and her pencil ready, because there was information to collect and a plan to make, and the next 3 days were not going to wait for anyone's feelings to settle. Caleb told them what he knew about Rudd. It was more than she'd expected, and worse than she'd hoped. Rudd had done this before, not in Montana Territory, but in the Eastern Territories. Two different situations, where he'd identified a claim worth having and used a combination of legal mechanisms and applied pressure to acquire it. In one case, the original owner had taken the buyout. In the other case, the original owner had held out until Rudd's men had made the holding out so costly that selling had become the only remaining option. What did costly look like? Eliza said. Caleb looked at the table. Accidents, he said. Trap lines destroyed, equipment damaged. A fire that might not have been an accident. The word fire sat in the room. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at his coffee cup with the expression of a man updating a calculation. He's not going to wait until Friday, Eliza said. No, Gideon said. The letter was to establish that he made a good faith effort, she said. The offer, the request for meeting, the reasonable timeline. He's building his version of events the same way Walter Crane builds his version of events. So that afterward, whatever he does, he can say he tried to do it peacefully. Caleb looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about this since the first morning, she said. What do we do? He said. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. Caleb rides to Helena, she said. He takes your documentation and his records, and he files the substantive challenge. He finds an attorney, if he can, someone who knows the land provisions. Someone who can make the filing stick. She held Gideon's gaze. While he's gone, we deal with whatever Rudd does before the challenge clears. That puts you here alone with one injured man, Caleb said. Gideon isn't injured, she said. Not yet, Caleb said. The words fell into the room with the weight of something nobody wanted to say, but everybody understood. She didn't answer him. She didn't answer him because there was no answer that made the risk smaller. And she was a woman who had never pretended a risk was smaller than it was. She had simply, her whole life, decided the risk was worth it and moved forward anyway. When do I leave? Caleb said. Tonight, Eliza said. Get to the Valley Road before Rudd's men are watching the property. If they see you leaving, they'll think he's running, Gideon said. Which is good. Let them think he's running. Let them think the pressure is working. Caleb looked at Gideon. Something passed between the two men, not warmth. Not trust, but the specific recognition that two people arrive at when they are temporarily on the same side of a problem and both know it. I'll leave at dark, Caleb said. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the documentation. The records, the money for Helena, the legal language, Eliza drafted from memory of her father's land disputes and what she'd seen on Briggs's desk. She wrote it out in full and went over it with Caleb line by line until she was certain he understood not just what it said but why each element mattered. Gideon watched her do this from across the table. At one point, she looked up and found him watching, and she said, "What?" and he said nothing, and looked back at the map he was drawing of the property approaches. And she went back to the document, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they were about to be alone on a mountain with Rudd and his Billings men and a land challenge that would take 10 days to clear. At dark, Caleb stood at the door with his horse saddled and the documents secured inside his coat. He looked at Eliza. She handed him the final page of her notes. Bottom of the third paragraph, she said. That's the specific provision. Don't let them redirect you to a general challenge. Insist on this provision by name. He took the page. He folded it carefully. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her all afternoon, with the expression of a man who has a great deal to say, and has finally understood that saying it is not the point. The doing is the point. I'll be back in 8 days, he said. 10, she said. Don't rush it. A rushed filing gives them grounds to contest the process. 10 then, he mounted his horse. He started south. She watched until she couldn't hear the hooves anymore. Then she turned. Gideon was standing in the doorway behind her. He might actually do it, she said. He might, Gideon said. She walked back to the door. She stopped beside him. Both of them looking south at the dark where her brother had gone. If he doesn't, she said, we deal with that when it happens. Yes, he said. And if Rudd moves before the challenge clears, we deal with that too, he said. She looked up at him. In the dark, his face was all angles and shadow and the specific stillness of someone who has been through enough hard things that new hard things don't change his expression, only his attention. Are you afraid? She said. He looked at her for a moment. Not of what's coming, he said. She understood what he meant. She was afraid of the same thing, not the danger, which was concrete and manageable, but the other thing. The thing that had been building for 3 weeks and had no concrete form and was therefore considerably harder to manage. She went inside. He followed. The door closed. The night settled over the mountain with all the weight and cold of a Montana February. And somewhere in the dark below the ridge, 3 men from Billings sat in rented rooms and waited for instructions. And Rudd looked at his map with a pen in his hand and began crossing out the patient approach and writing in something else. And in the cabin on the ridge, 2 people who had found each other in the middle of the worst winter of both their lives sat on opposite sides of a fire and understood, without saying it, that the next 10 days were going to test everything they'd built in 3 weeks, and they were going to have to trust that 3 weeks had been enough. 3 weeks. It was not enough time. It was all the time they had. Rudd didn't wait until Friday. He moved on Wednesday night. Eliza woke to the sound of the horse shelter door, not the sound of it opening. The sound of it being tested. Someone trying the latch slowly, checking whether it was barred. She lay still in the dark for exactly 2 seconds, cataloging what she was hearing, and then she was up, and her coat was on, and her rifle was in her hand before the 3rd second passed. She opened the bedroom door. Gideon was already standing in the main room, fully dressed, his rifle up. He looked at her without surprise. He pointed 2 fingers toward the east wall, east approach. Someone there, and then held up 3 fingers. 3. At least. She moved to the window without crossing in front of it. She positioned herself to the left of the frame, and looked out at the angle she could see from that position. The moonlight on the snow was bright enough to read by. The specific brutal clarity of a Montana winter night when the clouds have gone and the cold has polished the air to transparency. She saw 2 of them, moving along the east fence line. Staying low, moving with the purposeful crouch of men who have done this before. Not local men. The movement was wrong for local men too practiced, too professional. Billings men. She held up 2 fingers. She pointed east. He nodded. He pointed north. She looked north from her angle. She couldn't see clearly enough. She shook her head. He moved to the north window. He looked. He held up 1 finger. 1 north, 2 east, 3 total that they could see. She did the math that she didn't want to do. Rudd had brought 3 men from Billings. 3 men accounted for, which meant either Rudd wasn't here himself, or Rudd was the 4th element they hadn't located yet. She crossed to Gideon and said it directly into his ear. Barely a breath. Where is Rudd? He shook his head. He didn't know either. They stood in the dark cabin with the fire banked low and the cold coming in around the edges of the door, and 3 men working the perimeter outside. And Eliza thought, Rudd is watching. He's not with his men. He's in a position where he can see what they do and how we respond to it. He's still gathering information, which meant this was not the final push. This was the test before the final push. She put her mouth close to Gideon's ear again. They're testing our response. Rudd is watching. Don't give him what he wants to see. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. His face was very close to hers. What does he want to see? Whether you come out, she said. Whether you come out alone. Whether you're impulsive. Whether the shoulder slows you. She held his gaze. Stay inside. Let them make the first move. She could feel him resist the instruction. He was a man built for action, for meeting problems directly, for going out to whatever was coming rather than waiting for it to arrive. 9 years on a mountain alone had made him. That way the mountain rewarded directness and punished hesitation. But she was right, and he knew she was right. He stayed. They waited. The waiting was the hardest thing she had done in a long time. Not because she was afraid, a clean and useful fear, the kind that sharpens rather than paralyzes, but because waiting required holding herself completely still while every instinct she had was telling her to move. She stood at the left side of the window and watched the east fence line and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe when she was doing something that required her hands to be steady. 4 minutes passed. The man on the north side of the cabin tried the door. Not to open it, to test it. One hand against the wood. A slight push, feeling for how it was braced. The sound was subtle enough that she would have missed it if she hadn't been listening for exactly that kind of sound. Gideon heard it too. She saw his hand tighten on his rifle. She shook her head. Wait. He waited. Then one of the east fence men broke away from the fence line and moved toward the horse shelter again, not testing this time. Moving with purpose, moving toward the door, with his hand out to lift the latch. Eliza shot the ground 18 inches in front of his left boot. The sound of the rifle in the winter night was enormous. It cracked across the snow and bounced off the trees and came back changed. Bigger, and the man at the horse shelter door went completely rigid and then threw himself sideways into the snow, and the 2 other east fence men dropped to their stomachs. Gideon had the north door open in the same second. Rifle raised, positioned in the frame. The next one goes through something I intend it to go through, Eliza said. She said it loudly, clearly, without heat. The way you state a policy. Step back from the horse shelter. Silence, cold. Moonlight. 3 men in the snow trying to decide what the situation was now. The man at the horse shelter got to his feet. He stepped back. Further, she said. He stepped back to the fence line. The north man had not moved. She could see him from the window pressed against the cabin wall. A position that kept him out of Gideon's direct line from the door, but that she had a partial angle on. She deliberately looked away from that angle. She let him think he was safer than he was. Tell Rudd, she said, still in that same clear, carrying voice, that we've seen the filing. Tell him we know about Helena. Tell him his timeline is already closing. She paused. And tell him that what just happened is the polite version of how we respond to men on this property at night. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the dark tree line, to the northeast, a place she hadn't been watching. A position she hadn't identified, a voice. Miss Hartwell. Low. Considered. The voice of a man who has decided that if a situation is going to shift, he should be the one shifting it. Rudd. She had placed him wrong. Not watching from a distance, he'd been close enough to hear clearly, close enough to be in the scene rather than observing it. She adjusted her understanding of him in real time, which was something she'd had to do only a handful of times in her life, and which she filed as critical information. He was not a watching man. He was a present man who performed watching until the moment he decided to participate. I know your brother rode south last night, Rudd said. His voice was unhurried. I know where south leads. She said nothing. I know about the challenge you're planning, he said. I want you to know that I know, because I want this conversation to start from an honest place. Then come out from the tree line, she said. If you want an honest conversation, have it in the open. A pause. Rudd stepped out of the trees. He was medium height, broader through the chest than she'd expected, with a face that was organized and deliberate, a face that had learned over years to show exactly what its owner decided to show, and nothing else. He wore good clothes for a man standing in the snow at midnight, which told her something. He had dressed for a meeting, not a raid. He had always intended to be here in person. At this moment, he stopped 15 feet from the cabin. He looked at Gideon in the door. He looked at Eliza at the window. He made a decision she could see him making. He looked at her longer. I underestimated you, he said. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. The statement of a man updating his assessment. Most people do, she said. I'd like to make a proposal, he said. You've made several, she said. They've all been declined. This one is different, he said. This one is for you. She kept her face still. I'm listening. You're a practical woman, Rudd said. I can see that. And you're in a less complicated than it might appear from inside it. He took one step forward. Cross's claim is solid today, but a substantive challenge in Helena takes time and costs money. And in that time, a number of things can happen to a property that make it significantly harder to demonstrate continuous active use. He paused. Accidents. Damage. The kind of thing that happens to remote properties in hard weather when the occupants are dealing with other pressures. He let that land. I'm proposing that you encourage Cross to accept a fair price and walk away. In exchange, I'll ensure the process is clean and immediate, and you'll both have the resources to start somewhere without this history. She looked at him. She looked at his face, which was the face of a man who believed he was offering something reasonable. That was the most frightening thing about him. He actually believed it. He had organized his own thinking so thoroughly around what he wanted that the wanting had become logic, and the logic had become fairness, and the fairness had become an offer he could make with a straight face. Let me make sure I understand, she said. You're asking me to convince a man to sell his home, the home he built with his own hands after losing his wife and child, because you've filed a fraudulent land claim and you're threatening to manufacture the evidence that would make it look valid. Rudd's face changed slightly. Just slightly. The claim is not fraudulent, he said. The claim states that Gideon Cross has failed to maintain active use of his mining stake, she said. Gideon Cross worked that claim last summer from May through September. I can tell you the dates, the quantities extracted, and the weather conditions for every week of that period because I have his records and I've read them. She held Rudd's gaze. The claim is fraudulent. You know it's fraudulent. Sheriff Briggs knows it's fraudulent. The question is whether you're going to continue down this road now that you know we know. Rudd looked at her for a long moment. His men were still in their positions east fence, north wall, and the one she'd shot in front of, who had retreated to the fence line and was standing with the posture of someone who very much wanted to be somewhere else. The filing Rudd started. Will fail, she said. The substantive challenge will be filed within the week. The documentation is complete. My brother is carrying it to Helena right now. She paused. You spent 6 weeks building a legal mechanism, and it's going to fail. That's not a threat. That's a timeline. Rudd's jaw tightened. What I don't understand, she said, and she shifted her voice here, not softer, but different. The tone of someone genuinely trying to understand rather than simply argue is why a man with a working claim 2 valleys over needs this property badly enough to do what you've done to get it. Rudd looked at her. Something moved in his face, something she hadn't expected. Not anger. Something that looked, briefly, before he covered it, like exhaustion. The creek claim runs out by summer, he said. I have nothing behind it. She had not expected him to say that. She had not expected him to tell her the truth. She was very still. 2 years of work, he said. 2 years, and I have enough to last another year if I'm careful. And nothing after that. He looked at Gideon. Your stake doesn't run out. That's a mountain creek with 100 years of yield if it's worked right. I've been watching it long enough to know that. He looked back at her. I'm not a villain in my own story. Nobody is, she said. That's the problem. The night was very cold and very quiet. She thought about what he'd just said and what it cost him to say it, and whether the truth of it changed any of the facts of the situation. And she concluded that it didn't change the facts, but it changed the frame. And sometimes the frame was everything. Here's what's actually available to you, she said. Not a buyout. Not a forced sale. Listen to me carefully. She waited until she was certain she had his full attention. Gideon Cross has been working this mountain alone for 9 years. He's worked the creek claim alone, and the trap lines alone, and built and repaired everything on this property alone. She glanced at Gideon just briefly, and she saw in his face that he did not know where she was going, which meant she was about to surprise him too. One man, even a capable one, leaves yield on the table. A claim like the Upper Creek, properly worked with adequate labor. Eliza, Gideon said. Let me finish, she said, not harshly. Clearly he stopped. She looked back at Rudd. There is a legitimate business arrangement available if both parties approach it legitimately. Not what you've been offering. Something with legal terms. Documented shares and a timeline that doesn't require anyone to burn anything down or file anything fraudulent. She held his gaze. But that conversation requires you to go home tonight and come back without your Billings men and with a lawyer. Not a rifle. And it requires you to understand that whatever happens, this property belongs to Gideon Cross and will continue to belong to Gideon Cross. And any arrangement starts from that fact. Rudd looked at her. He looked at Gideon. Gideon was looking at Eliza with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She would think about that expression later, when there was time to think. Right now there was no time. You're offering me a legitimate path, Rudd said slowly. I'm offering you the only path that ends with you having something real in 5 years, she said. The other path ends with a failed land claim, a sheriff's record, and 2 years of work thrown away. She paused. You said you're not a villain in your own story. Then stop acting like one. The silence stretched. One of the east fencemen shifted his weight. The sound of it was very loud. Rudd looked at the ground. Then he looked up. Walter Crane told me you were a woman who could be redirected, he said. Walter Crane, she said, has never understood what I am. Rudd looked at her for one more long moment. Then he turned to his men. We're done for tonight, he said. The east fence men stood up from their position. The north wall man appeared from around the corner. They came together in the space between the cabin and the tree line, with the uncertain movement of men who had come prepared for one kind of night and were leaving with something else entirely. Rudd looked back at the cabin, at Gideon. I'll come back, he said. Legally, with a lawyer, like she said. If the offer stands. Gideon looked at Eliza. She looked at Gideon. A long moment. The offer stands, Gideon said. Rudd nodded. He walked back into the trees. His men followed. And then they were gone, the sound of horses receding, until the night was just the wind and the cold, and the two of them standing in the moonlit snow in front of the cabin. Eliza lowered her rifle. Her arms were shaking. Not from the weight of it. She had held a rifle for longer than that, without her arms shaking. The shaking was from somewhere else. From the place where the last 90 minutes had been happening inside her body, while her face stayed still, and her voice stayed level, and her hands stayed where they needed to be. She sat down on the cabin step, right there in the cold. In the snow, she just sat down, because her legs had decided they were done, holding her up for the moment, and she was not going to argue with them. Gideon came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask if she was all right. He just sat, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him on her left side. And he was there, which was the only thing that was required. You offered Rudd a partnership, he said, after a while, when the shaking had mostly passed. I offered him a way out, she said. That's different. You didn't ask me, I know. She looked at him. I'm asking you now. He was looking at the tree line where Rudd had disappeared. His profile in the moonlight was the profile she had been learning for 3 weeks, the specific arrangement of angles and shadow that she had begun to map without deciding to. The way you map the features of a place you've been living. A legitimate arrangement, he said. Legal terms. Documented shares. Yes. He'd have no claim on the property itself. None. The property stays yours. The arrangement covers the creek-claim labor and yield only, with a sunset clause and full termination rights. She paused. I drafted the general terms in my head while I was talking to him. I can write them out tonight. He looked at her. You drafted contract terms, he said, while you were conducting a midnight negotiation with an armed man. I draft things constantly, she said. It's how I think. He made the sound that lived just before a laugh. She had heard it a handful of times, and each time it surprised her because it was so at odds with the rest of his presentation. This almost law, this suggestion that underneath the mountain man who trusted nobody was a person who found things genuinely funny. Eliza, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had not had time to examine earlier, the one she had put aside to deal with later. She was looking at it now. Later had arrived. It was not a complicated expression. That was the thing about this man, his face. When he allowed it to show something, showed it simply. No performance, no management, just the thing itself. He was looking at her, the way people look at things they have decided they don't want to lose. Her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with cold or rifles or midnight negotiations. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" he said. "Don't look at me like that right now," she said. "I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm still shaking. I don't have the capacity right now to also—" She gestured inadequately at the space between them and what it contained. "All right," he said. He looked back at the tree line. She looked at the snow. They sat on the cabin step in the cold, side by side, not quite touching, and the night settled around them, and the shaking in her arms gradually became less, and the thing she didn't have capacity for sat between them, patient as the winter and twice as certain. "The partnership offer," he said after a while. "I'll honor it if he comes back clean." "I know," she said. "But if he doesn't, we deal with that when it happens," she said. "That's what we do. We deal with what's actually in front of us." He looked at her. "What's actually in front of us," he said, and his voice had changed. Had gone quieter. "Is a woman sitting on my front step in -15 degrees after talking 3 armed men off my property. And I am." He stopped. He was a man who chose his words the way he chose his footing on uncertain ground carefully, testing before committing. "I am not a man who knows how to say things like this," he said. "I haven't needed to know for 9 years." "I know," she said. "I'm going to say it badly," he said. "Say it anyway," she said. He looked at the snow. "I built this cabin for 2, he said. "I told you I stocked for 2 out of habit. That's true." But he paused. "I never stopped building for 2. In 9 years I never once looked at this cabin and thought, this is exactly the right size. I always thought it was 1 room short. 1 chair empty. 1 hook on the wall that nothing hung on." He was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks ago, something hung on it." She looked at the cabin door. She looked at the hook beside it, where her coat hung. She felt something move through her, not the shaking. Nothing like the shaking. Something completely different. Something warm and frightening and absolutely certain. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. "Too much, too fast." "After everything tonight, Gideon," she said again. He stopped. She turned and looked at him directly in the moonlight. "I have been alone my entire life," she said. "In a house full of people. Surrounded by family, keeping everyone alive and completely alone. Because being needed is not the same as being seen. And being useful is not the same as being wanted." Her voice was very steady. She needed it to be steady for this. "I walked into your trading post 2 weeks ago, and a man I had never met looked at me like I was a person. Just that, just a person, and I didn't know." She stopped. Took 1 breath. "I didn't know how hungry I was for that until it happened." He was very still. "I'm not saying this because of tonight," she said. "I'm not saying it because I'm shaken. I've been thinking it for 10 days, and I've been keeping it in the place where I keep things I'm not ready for." She held his gaze. "I'm ready." He looked at her. He reached out with his good hand, the scarred, worked, capable hand of a man who had built everything he owned and carried everything he'd lost, and was reaching out anyway, and he put it over hers where it lay on her knee. She turned her hand over. She held on. They sat on the step in the cold Montana night. Her hand in his, the rifle across her knees, the moonlight hard and bright on the snow. And neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more to say that the holding didn't already say better. Inside the cabin, the banked fire breathed. On the hook by the door, her coat hung next to his, and somewhere on the road south toward Helena, Caleb Hartwell rode through the winter dark with documents in his coat and something to prove. And in 10 days, he would come back with either the thing that made all of this permanent or the news that the next fight was still us. But that was 10 days from now. Tonight, for the first time in her life, Eliza Hartwell sat still in the cold and didn't calculate the next move and didn't manage the next problem and didn't hold anything together for anyone. She just held on. And it was enough. It was, she thought, The most enough anything had ever been. Caleb came back on the 9th day. Eliza heard the horse before she saw it 2 horses. Actually, and she was at the window before the sound fully registered. Her hand already moving toward the rifle on the table before she caught herself. 9 days of living at a particular level of alertness had changed her reflexes. She would notice that for months afterward, the way her body had learned, in that stretch of cold and waiting, to treat every unexpected sound as information requiring immediate assessment. She looked out. Caleb. And someone riding beside him. She didn't recognize a man in a city coat. Too good for the road he'd been traveling, carrying a leather satchel across his saddle horn. She exhaled. She went to the door. Gideon came out of the back room where he'd been working on the trap mechanisms with his good hand. His injured shoulder still wrapped, moving better than it had a week ago, but not yet what it would be. He saw her face at the door. "Caleb," she said. He came to stand behind her. They watched the 2 riders come up the north road. Caleb sat his horse the way he had been sitting it differently. She noticed, since the morning he'd ridden southwind with documents in his coat. Straighter, more deliberate, as if the 9 days of having an actual purpose had reorganized something in his posture that failure had slowly curved inward. She opened the door before he dismounted. He swung down and looked at her, and he was tired, road tired, and winter tired, and the particular tired of a man who has been operating at the edge of his capability and knows it, but underneath the tired was something else. Something she hadn't seen on her brother's face in years. He had done the thing. She could see it before he said a word. "Thomas Aldridge," he said, gesturing to the man beside him, who was dismounting with the careful movements of someone whose body had strong opinions about 9 days on horseback in February. "Land attorney. Helena." He filed the challenge on day 3, and he rode back with me to provide documentation in person if Rudd contests the process. Aldridge straightened up from his horse and looked at Eliza with the expression of a man who has been told something about a person and is now comparing the description to the reality. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "your brother has told me a considerable amount about you. I hope it was accurate," she said. "More accurate than most client descriptions," he said. "He told me you drafted the substantive challenge language from memory based on a document you read for 4 minutes in a sheriff's office." He opened his satchel and removed a folded document. "I made 3 amendments. I'd like to walk you through them." She looked at the document. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone waiting for a verdict they know they deserve, but are afraid of anyway. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you." She said it to both of them. But she was looking at Caleb when she said it, and he understood the difference, not forgiveness. Not yet, but a door open, because he had done the work that a door requires. He came inside. They sat around the table, all 4 of them, and Aldridge went through the amended language and asked questions, and Gideon listened and said little, because this was her territory more than his, and he knew it and didn't pretend otherwise. Twice, Aldridge paused mid-explanation and looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize from professional men who had expected to be explaining something to a woman and found themselves instead in a conversation with an equal. She didn't find it satisfying the way she once might have. She just needed the information to be correct. "The challenge will hold," Aldridge said, when they had been through the full document. "Rudd's filing had 3 procedural weaknesses that your brother's documentation exposes directly. The land office in Helena has already acknowledged receipt. Rudd will be notified within the week." "He already knows," Gideon said. Aldridge looked at him. "He came here 9 days ago," Gideon said. "We had a conversation." He glanced at Eliza. "Miss Hartwell had a conversation." "He knows the challenge is coming." Aldridge looked at Eliza. "What kind of conversation?" he said carefully. "The kind that may have changed his approach," she said. "He's agreed to come back with a lawyer and discuss a legitimate arrangement regarding the creek claim." She paused. "Whether he follows through is another question." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. "You negotiated with him." "I gave him a door to walk through," she said. "That's different from negotiation." "What's the difference?" Negotiation implies both parties have things to offer, she said. At the time of the conversation, Rudd had a failing land claim and men who had just been shot at. The door I gave him was the only exit available that didn't end badly for everyone. She held Aldridge's gaze. I gave him the truth and let him decide what to do with it. Aldridge sat back in his chair. He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the table with the expression of a man who has learned. Over 9 days of writing and filing and explaining his sister to a stranger, that there is a difference between knowing a person's value and understanding it, and that he had known without understanding for 25 years and was now, at great personal cost, beginning to understand. Miss Hartwell, Aldridge said, when I return to Helena, I intend to leave you my direct contact information. Not as a formality. He paused. The territory has a shortage of people who can read a legal situation clearly under pressure and respond to it correctly. That shortage is felt in ways that cost people considerably. I appreciate that, she said. I mean it practically, he said. I know, she said. I'll think about it. She would think about it. Later. When the immediate things were handled, and she had the space to consider what came next on her own terms rather than in response to someone else's need. Aldridge left the following morning with coffee for the road that she had made, and Gideon had pressed money into his hand and he rode south with the document copies, secured in his satchel, and the particular satisfied expression of a man who had done good work in difficult conditions. Caleb stayed. He stayed because there was work to be done on the property that one good arm and one able-bodied woman couldn't fully manage, and because the east fence section was down in 2 places, and because nobody said he should go and he didn't suggest it. He slept near the fire and worked from first light and did not ask for things that hadn't been offered. On the 3rd day after his return, he and Eliza were working the east fence together, her holding the post. Him driving it, and the work made conversation both easier and less required, which was the best condition for the kind of conversation they needed to have. She spoke first. You did it, she said. You told me how, he said. I told you what needed doing, she said. Doing it is different. He drove the post twice more. Set the mallet down. Looked at the fence rather than at her. I had 9 days on the road, he said. A lot of hours with nothing but the horse and the cold and my own thinking. He paused. I've been doing my own thinking for 25 years and mostly making poor use of it. This time I tried to do it honestly. She waited. I've been carrying Father's leaving wrong, he said. I decided when he left that I was the one responsible. The man of the family. The one who had to hold everything together. He looked at his hands on the mallet. But I was 15 and scared, and I didn't know how to hold anything together. So I decided things instead of doing them. I decided we'd be fine. I decided the debt would work out. I decided his jaw tightened. I decided you could be used to solve a problem because I had been using you to solve problems for 10 years and you had never once told me to stop. She kept her hands on the post. Why didn't you tell me to stop, he said. It was not accusatory. It was genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly. Because I thought if I was useful enough, she said slowly. If I was indispensable enough, that would be the same as being loved. She felt the truth of it as she said it. The way you feel the truth of things you've been carrying so long you forgot you were carrying them. I confused being needed with belonging, and as long as I kept being needed, I never had to test whether anyone would stay if I stopped. Caleb was very still. We were both wrong, she said. You used me because it was available. I let myself be used because I didn't know how to ask for the alternative. She looked at him. That doesn't make what you did acceptable. But it means the story is more complicated than one person's fault. It was my fault, he said. What happened in the trading post was my fault. I'm not distributing that. I know, she said. I'm saying that what happened in the trading post came from something longer. And the longer thing that we share. He looked at her. His eyes were wet. He was not going to cry, or if he was going to cry, he was going to do it at a different time. Alone, which was his right. But his eyes were wet and he did not hide it. I'm going to be better, he said. I know, she said. You can't know. I know you. I have known you your entire life. I know what you look like when you're convincing yourself of something, and I know what you look like when you've actually decided something. She held his gaze. This is decided, I can see it, he exhaled. Pick up the mallet, she said. There are 2 more posts. He picked up the mallet. They finished the fence. Rudd came back on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of March, when the snow had begun its slow retreat from the lower paths and the quality light had changed from the flat white of deep winter to something with more angle, more warmth, the specific light of a season, turning whether you're ready for it or not. He came alone. No Billings men. A horse and a lawyer and a leather briefcase that the lawyer carried. A young man from Pine Creek named Harris who looked slightly terrified to be on this particular errand and was managing it with determined professionalism. Eliza saw them from the window. She turned to Gideon, who was at the table with his coffee. Rudd, she said. And a lawyer. Gideon looked up. He came, he said. He came, she confirmed. Something passed across Gideon's face, not surprise. Not satisfaction. Something more like the expression of a man who has revised an opinion he held for 9 years and is now watching the revision prove correct. He had believed, since Eleanor and Thomas, that people were mostly not worth the risk of trusting. He had structured his entire life around that belief. He had been wrong. He was learning at 40 years old that being wrong about a thing you built your life around was not the end of the life. It was, if you let it be, the beginning of the next one. Shall we go out, she said. We'll go out, he said. They went out together. Rudd pulled up and dismounted with the measured movements of a man who has thought carefully about this moment and intends to conduct it correctly. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the rifle she was not carrying, which she had deliberately not carried, because today was not that kind of day, and she needed him to know she understood the difference. Mr. Cross, he said. Rudd, Gideon said. Rudd looked at Eliza. Miss Hartwell. I said I'd come back with a lawyer. He gestured to the young man beside him. This is James Harris. He represents my interests, and he's prepared to represent them honestly. Harris nodded at both of them. Come inside, Eliza said. They negotiated for 4 hours. She drove it. Not because Gideon couldn't. He was a capable man, and he knew the value of what he had, but because she had drafted the framework of it, and she knew every joint and corner of it and could feel when the conversation was moving towards something that would hold, and when it was moving towards something that would crack under pressure. Rudd bargained hard. She had expected that, and she respected it. A man who stops bargaining entirely is a man who has decided the outcome doesn't matter to him. And she needed Rudd to care about the outcome. She gave ground where the ground didn't matter and held where it did. And twice she caught Rudd looking at her with the expression of someone encountering a thing they hadn't accounted for in their preparation. Harris took notes. Gideon said little, and when he spoke it was precise and final. The way a mountain man speaks when he has heard enough to know what the right answer is, 2 or 3 words that settled things Rudd was still trying to move. By the time the afternoon light had shifted toward evening, they had the shape of an agreement. Rudd's Billings men would work the Upper Creek claim from May through September. Rudd would provide the labor and equipment. Gideon would maintain the claim rights in full and receive 60% of the yield. Rudd would receive 40%. The arrangement had a 3-year term and a full termination clause at Gideon's discretion. The land, the cabin, the property, the trap lines, everything above and below the earth that Gideon Cross has ubbed and worked and lived on was not part of the arrangement, could not be part of the arrangement, was not mentioned in the arrangement except to affirm, in the first paragraph, in clear and unambiguous language that she had insisted upon, that it was and would remain entirely his. Rudd signed it. Harris notarized it. Gideon signed it. Eliza witnessed it. When Rudd stood to leave, he paused at the door with his hat in his hands. He looked at Eliza. I told Walter Crane you could be redirected, he said. I was wrong about that. Yes, she said. What are you? Exactly, he said. Not unkindly. with the genuine puzzlement of a man trying to file something into a category that doesn't exist. She looked at him for a moment. "Exactly what I appear to be," she said. "That's all I've ever been. The problem is that most people don't look carefully enough to see it." He nodded slowly. He left. Harris followed, clutching his documents with the relief of a young lawyer who has completed a complex transaction and is very much looking forward to being somewhere warmer. The cabin door closed. Gideon and Eliza stood in the middle of the room. He looked at the signed document on the table. She looked at it too. "I want to go to Pine Creek," she said. He looked at her. "Not today," she said. "When the roads are clear. There's something I need to do there." He didn't ask what. He would ask later, or she would tell him. But he understood in the way that people who have learned each other's rhythms understand that this was something she had been carrying for a while and needed to carry for a little longer before she could set it down. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She picked up her coffee cup. She found it empty, and she went to the stove to refill it, and when she turned around, Gideon was standing close behind her, which startled her because he moved quietly, and she had been in her own thoughts. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had stopped trying to decode it, because it only meant one thing, and she already knew what that thing was. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You did good today." "We did good today," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You built that agreement in your head before he arrived. You knew every concession before he asked for it, and every line before he tried to cross it." He held her gaze. "That was you." She felt something warm move through her chest. Not pride exactly. The specific feeling of being seen accurately, of having the thing you actually did acknowledged as the thing you actually did, without diminishment, without the qualification that women learn to expect after every competence. "I had good material to protect," she said. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he put his hand on her face, just his palm against her cheek. The scarred and careful hand of a man who had decided, after 9 years of deciding against, to reach towards something, and she closed her eyes and leaned into it. Just slightly, just enough, and the warmth of it was the warmth of a thing that has been cold for a very long time, finally moving toward heat. She covered his hand with hers. They stood in the kitchen in the afternoon light, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. The roads cleared in the 3rd week of March. She rode into Pine Creek on a Wednesday morning, alone, having told Gideon where she was going and what for, having Arenta accepted his offer to come with her and then declined it, because this was something she needed to do in her own body, with her own voice on her own terms. Walter Crane's trading post had new owners. The sign was different. Through the window, she could see a woman stocking shelves, a real reorganization. Nothing where it had been. Everything considered and placed with intention. She stopped and looked at the window for a moment. She did not go in. Walter was not her business today. She found him where she expected to find a man who has lost his business and his influence in a small town at the far end of the main road. At the table of a boarding house that still served him coffee because it served everyone coffee and had not yet found a reason to stop. He was sitting with his hands around a cup and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is deciding how to feel about what his life has become. He looked up when she walked in. He went very still. She sat down across from him. She didn't wait for him to speak. She had not come here to watch him prepare something. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Not for my sake. For yours." She held his gaze directly in the way she had held it across his counter on the night that felt both recent and very long ago. What happened in this town in February was not a transaction that went wrong. It was not a business disagreement. You looked at a human being and decided she was a commodity. And you moved forward with that decision because every structure in place told you that you could. Walter's jaw tightened. The debt was legitimate. The debt was legitimate, she said. The method was not. There is a difference between being owed money and being owed a person. And you knew that difference and proceeded anyway. She paused. "I'm not here to destroy you further. You've done most of that yourself. I'm here because I spent 25 years in this territory, being treated as something less than what I was. And I watched other women being treated the same way. And I want at least one of the men who perpetuated that to have to sit across from me and hear that I know exactly what was done, and I am exactly unchanged by it. Walter said nothing. I am unchanged, she said. I want you to understand that clearly. What you did didn't diminish me. It didn't break me. It didn't redirect me. She looked at him steadily. It just showed me which direction to walk, and I walked it. She stood up. She buttoned her coat. I hope you find something useful to do with whatever comes next, she said. I mean that without irony. A man with nothing to do becomes a problem for everyone around him. Find something to do. She walked out. She stood on the main road of Pine Creek and breathed the March air, which was cold but different from February's cold, thinner, carrying the specific smell of something underneath the ice, beginning to move again. The smell of a world, remembering that it knew how to change. She stood there for a moment. She was not triumphant. She had not expected to be. The conversation with Walter was not the end of something. It was the acknowledgement of something that had already ended. The formal notation in a record she was keeping for herself. She was done. Not done with Pine Creek. Not done with the territory. Not done with the work of being a woman in a place that had not yet decided how to value one. That work would continue. It would continue for the rest of her life, and she knew it. But she was done being the version of herself that had accepted the terms everyone else set. She rode north. The road up the ridge was beginning to clear, the packed snow turning to mud at the edges, where the afternoon sun found it. And her horse moved through it with the comfortable certainty of an animal that knows its direction. She rode without hurrying, in the specific way of someone who is moving toward something rather than away from something and can feel the difference. The cabin came into view with smoke rising from the chimney and both horses in the shelter and the new garden bed she had turned along the south wall last week, ready for planting when the ground was fully soft. Her coat was on the hook. Her notes were in the supply shelf notebook. Her handwriting was on the property challenge documents in Helena. And the man she had arrived here as a stranger to was at the table when she pushed open the door reading. Coffee beside him, and he looked up when she came in. And he did not ask how it went, because he could see how it went, in the way she moved, and the way she hung up her coat, the way she poured herself coffee, and sat down across from him with the particular settled quality of someone who has put down something heavy and intends to leave it on the ground. He looked at her. She looked at him. Aldridge wrote, she said. The letter came yesterday. The challenge has been formally acknowledged. Rudd's claim is closed. I know, he said. I read it. And it's done, he said. It's done, she agreed. She drank her coffee. He read his book. The fire held. Outside, the March light moved across the snow and found the first edges of bare ground at the base of the south wall, where the garden waited. And the upper creek ran under its ice, beginning the slow work of becoming a creek again. And the trap lines held their patient catches, and the mountain did what mountains do, endured. Unchanging in its outline, even as everything on its surface turned and shifted and began again. Caleb came up the following Sunday, and Jonah with him. And the four of them sat around the table that had seen legal documents and mid-honest plans and onic conversation, and the particular negotiations of two people learning what were to each other. And Jonah had cooked something that wasn't quite right, but was made with such visible effort that it was right in the ways that mattered. And Caleb brought a bottle of something he'd traded for in town, and poured 4 cups and looked at his sister. To surviving the winter, he said. She looked at her cup. She thought about what surviving the winter had meant. She thought about the trading post and the ledger and $60 and a man who walked through a door. She thought about 11 books on a shelf and coffee made for 2. She thought about a land claim and a midnight negotiation and a rifle shot in the snow and a man's hand against her cheek in the afternoon light. She thought about Walter Crane's face when she told him she was unchanged. She picked up her cup. To what comes after, she said. Gideon picked up his cup. Caleb and Jonah picked up theirs. They drank, and the cabin on the ridge above Pine Creek held them all. This house that had been built for two, and had spent 9 years as one, and had become, in the space of a single brutal winter, the place where a woman who had never been allowed to stand still finally stopped moving, long enough to find out what she was made of. She was made of everything they had tried to spend. And it had not run out. It had not even come close. The debt that began with $60 in gold on a February night ended with something that had no price and needed none, a name on a deed, a coat on a hook, a garden against the south wall, and a man across a table who had seen her clearly from the very first moment and had never once looked away. That was the whole of it. That was everything, and it was at last entirely hers.